The medical bay of the Asclepius hummed with the quiet efficiency of automated systems monitoring 3 critical patients. Dr. Ethan Reeves moved between them with practiced precision, checking readouts and adjusting treatment protocols based on the moment-by-moment changes in their conditions. All 3 were Velari, survivors of what appeared to be a targeted attack on a diplomatic courier. 2 were security personnel with extensive but manageable injuries. The third was Ambassador Lyran Charville, whose vital signs concerned Ethan more than her guards, despite initial assessments suggesting the opposite. Velari physiology was similar enough to human that standard trauma protocols mostly worked, but different enough that assumptions could be fatal. Their cardiovascular systems ran at different pressures. Their pain responses were muted. They could endure injuries that would incapacitate humans while maintaining consciousness and coherence. Their healing was accelerated by factors Ethan didn't fully understand, but had learned to account for in treatment planning. He'd closed the visible wounds, plasma burns across her shoulder, lacerations on her arms where shrapnel had torn through her environmental suit, a concussion that had required careful monitoring. Her long ears, pressed flat against her skull, indicated pain being suppressed through sheer will. Her luminescent eyes, which had been amber when she'd first regained consciousness, had settled into dull gray, a color that, in his 18 months of frontier medical work, he'd learned indicated trauma beyond just the physical. "Ambassador," Ethan said, approaching her bed after ensuring her guards were stable. "Your external injuries are responding well to treatment, but I want to do a full systemic scan to ensure there's no internal bleeding or organ damage we haven't detected." Lyran's eyes focused on him, the first real sign of alertness she'd shown since the initial emergency treatment. "That will not. There are complications with full scanning, cultural sensitivities." Ethan had encountered this before. Many species had restrictions about medical procedures that intersected with religious or cultural beliefs. "I understand, but if there are internal injuries we're missing, they could become critical. Can you tell me specifically what regions I should avoid, and I'll work around them?" "It is difficult to explain in standard." Lyran's voice carried frustration beneath the careful diplomatic tone. "There are aspects of Velari physiology that are not discussed with outsiders, not from shame but from—" she searched for words, "from the belief that others cannot properly understand or respect them." "Okay." Ethan pulled up a chair, recognizing this conversation needed more time than standing over her bed aloud. "I'm not here to violate cultural boundaries, but I am here to keep you alive and healthy. If there are injuries I need to treat, I need to know about them. Everything I see and learn stays within medical confidentiality. That's not just protocol, it's my oath." Lyran studied him with those shifting eyes, clearly weighing options. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "There is another injury, in a private region, one that I would normally wait to have treated by Velari medical personnel." "How far are we from the nearest station with Velari medical facilities?" 3 standard days at current velocity." 3 days, Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Is the injury worsening? Is it causing complications that can't wait 3 days?" Lyran's silence was answer enough. "Then we need to address it," Ethan said firmly but gently. "I understand there are cultural concerns, and I'll respect them as much as I can while still providing appropriate care. But if we're talking about an injury that's getting worse, those concerns become secondary to keeping you functional and healthy." "It may not be immediately fatal," Lyran admitted, and Ethan noticed her hands were clenched, pain she was suppressing. "But the damage it is extensive, and the pain is." She stopped, clearly struggling with admitting vulnerability. Ethan had worked with enough trauma patients to recognize someone downplaying severity to avoid inconvenience or embarrassment. "Ambassador Lyran, I'm going to be direct because I think that's what this situation requires. If there's an injury that needs treatment, I need to assess it. I can promise you medical confidentiality, as much dignity as circumstances allow, and professional focus on healing rather than judgment. But I can't help if I don't know what I'm dealing with." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Lyron spoke so quietly that Ethan almost didn't hear. "It hurts, down there too." The phrasing was deliberately vague, but Ethan understood the general implication. "All right, I'm going to need to examine the injury to determine appropriate treatment. I can have a female staff member present if that would make you more comfortable." "No," Lyron's response was sharp, almost alarmed. "Fewer who know the better. What I am asking you to see is—" "Dr. Reeves, this knowledge is not supposed to leave Velari medical circles. What you will discover. It is why we have maintained certain boundaries with other species. If this becomes known—" "Medical confidentiality," Ethan interrupted gently but firmly. "Whatever I see, whatever treatment is required, it stays between medical personnel who have legitimate need to know. That's not negotiable. That's the foundation of medical ethics, regardless of species." Lyron studied him for a long moment, her luminescent eyes shifting through colors he couldn't quite interpret. "Very well, but you must understand, what you are about to see will change how you perceive my species. And I cannot predict whether that change will be for better or worse." Ethan set up privacy screens around the exam area and ensured no one else was in the immediate bay. When he returned, Lyron had positioned herself as he'd requested, and he could see the tension in every line of her body. Whatever she was about to reveal violated something deeply private. "I'm going to examine the injury now," Ethan said, keeping his voice clinical and steady. "Tell me immediately if the pain becomes unbearable or if you need me to stop for any reason." He began the examination carefully, expecting perhaps internal injuries to reproductive anatomy that might be culturally sensitive, or damage to excretory systems that many species preferred not to discuss with outsiders. What he found instead made his hand still completely. Beneath the external anatomy that appeared superficially similar to human female structure, there was something entirely different. A secondary reproductive system that incorporated both male and female biological features in a configuration unlike anything in his xenobiology training. It wasn't hermaphroditism as humans understood the term. It was more complex, more integrated, suggesting evolutionary development toward reproductive flexibility that went far beyond simple dual-sex characteristics. The injury had damaged this hidden anatomy, tearing tissue that was clearly sensitive and vital in ways he could only partially comprehend from visual examination alone. Ethan's medical training warred with his shock. He'd treated dozens of alien species, seen physiology that challenged human assumptions about how bodies could function. But this was a fundamental secret that the Velari had apparently kept from every other species in the concordance. "Doctor," Lyron's voice carried resignation. "Now you understand why this was problematic." Ethan forced himself to focus, to push past the shock and engage with the immediate medical reality. "I understand why this is sensitive," he said carefully, not moving his hands from where they'd frozen. "But right now, my concern is treating the injury. Everything else is secondary. Can you tell me about the physiology I'm seeing? I need to understand it to treat it safely." "We are—" Lyron paused, clearly choosing words carefully. "Velari are dual-sexed, not in the way your biology texts might define hermaphroditism, but in a more complex integration tied to hormonal cycles and life phases. What you are seeing is anatomy that is currently in recessive phase, present but not primary. The injury has damaged tissue that is normally protected but was exposed through the primary wounds. And if left untreated, permanent damage to reproductive viability, hormonal imbalances that could affect my health for the rest of my life, chronic pain that would require extensive intervention." Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the fear beneath the control. "This is why I needed to tell you. why I violated protocols that have been maintained for centuries. Ethan began moving again, examining the extent of the damage with gentle precision. How long has your species kept this information confidential? Since we first encountered other spacefaring civilizations, we learned early that most species react poorly to biological realities that challenge their own frameworks. Humans are barely beginning to expand beyond binary gender concepts. How would your governments respond to learning that an entire species operates on fundamentally different principles? Probably poorly, Ethan admitted, though that's not a reason to let you suffer permanent damage. I'm going to need to repair this, which means working with anatomy I've never encountered. I'll need your guidance on what's safe to manipulate and what might cause additional trauma. What followed was 3 hours of meticulous work, with Lyran guiding him through anatomy that existed in no human medical text. She explained the biological functions with clinical precision, despite obvious pain and profound embarrassment at having to discuss what her culture considered sacred privacy. Ethan worked with absolute focus, asking questions only when necessary for medical safety, maintaining the professional detachment that had served him through countless difficult procedures. But part of his mind was also processing the larger implications, political, social, medical, of what he was learning. The Velari had maintained diplomatic and trade relations with humanity for 2 decades. Treaties had been signed, cultural exchanges had occurred, scientific cooperation had advanced in multiple fields. And through all of it, they'd hidden this fundamental aspect of their biology. Not out of shame, Lyran explained during a pause in the procedure, but out of protection. Protection for their culture from species who might not understand. Protection for individuals from being reduced to their biology. Protection for the sacred nature of something central to Velari identity. When Ethan finally completed the repairs, using techniques adapted on the fly for anatomy he'd never imagined existing, both he and Lyran were exhausted. He cleaned and bandaged the external wounds carefully, ensuring privacy was maintained throughout. "The immediate damage is repaired," he said quietly, "but you're going to need follow-up care from specialists who understand Velari physiology better than I do. Specialists from your own medical tradition, preferably. I will ensure appropriate follow-up." Lyran's voice was weak with fatigue. "Dr. Reeves, thank you for treating me with dignity, for not reacting as I feared you might." "You're my patient," Ethan replied. "Everything else is secondary to that responsibility, though I'll admit this does raise questions about broader medical cooperation between our species. If this biological reality affects all Velari, the medical implications alone are complex," Lyran finished, "which is why my people have chosen privacy over attempted explanation. But you have given me something to think about, Doctor. You saw what no human has seen, learned what we have protected for generations, and you simply healed me, treated the knowledge with respect rather than exploitation or judgment." "That's just medicine," Ethan said. "Bodies are bodies, regardless of how they challenge our assumptions about what's normal. My job is to treat them with competence and dignity, not to judge them against some arbitrary standard." Lyran's luminescent eyes shifted to a color Ethan had never seen before, soft gold with hints of blue. "That perspective is rare, even among those we consider allies." "Then maybe your allies need better medical training," Ethan suggested with a slight smile. "Though I suspect this is about more than just medical education." "It is about trust," Lyran agreed, "and fear of what happens when trust is violated. But you have shown me that trust, carefully placed, can be honored. That is worth remembering." Over the following days, as Lyran recovered under Ethan's careful monitoring, they had guarded conversations about the implications of what he'd discovered. She explained more about Velari culture and biology, trusting him with information that had never been shared with humans. He learned that Velari society had no fixed gender roles, because their biology made such fixedness impossible. Individuals transitioned through different phases across their lifespan, and their culture had evolved to treat this fluidity as sacred rather than problematic. The secrecy, she explained, wasn't about shame. It was about protecting something precious from species whose frameworks couldn't accommodate such complexity without reducing it to curiosity or fetish. But the secrecy had costs. Medical complications became dangerous when Velari operated in mixed-species environments. Cultural isolation limited the depth of possible alliances, and the weight of maintaining such a fundamental secret created barriers to genuine understanding. When Velari officials arrived to retrieve their ambassador, the situation became complicated in new ways. The senior physician, Corvin Shao, immediately recognized that Ethan knew far more than any human should. The conversation that followed was tense, with Corvin alternating between gratitude for the medical care and barely veiled threats about what might happen if the knowledge Ethan possessed became public. "You have seen what outsiders are not meant to see," Corvin said blunt. "Lie during a private meeting in Ethan's office. This creates complications for both our species." "I treated an injured patient using the knowledge necessary to preserve her health and future well-being," Ethan responded, keeping his tone level despite the implied threat. "That's not a crime under concordance medical ethics, and I'm not going to apologize for doing my job properly." "No one is asking you to apologize." Corvin's luminescent eyes were hard amber, fear mixed with defensive aggression. "We are asking you to understand the gravity of what you now know. Your species already views us with caution. Learning that we have concealed such fundamental aspects of our biology could destroy the fragile diplomatic progress we've achieved." "So you want me to pretend I didn't see what I saw, to falsify medical records and potentially endanger any future Velari patients I might treat?" Ethan leaned forward. "That violates every principle of medical ethics I hold. I won't do it." "Then what assurances can you provide that this information remains confidential?" "The same assurances I provide every patient regardless of species," Ethan said firmly. "Medical confidentiality is absolute. What I learned while treating Ambassador Lyran stays in medical records accessible only to care providers with legitimate need to know. I will not publish, discuss with non-medical personnel, or share this information outside those strict boundaries. And if your government compels disclosure, then I'll refuse on grounds of patient confidentiality and accept whatever consequences follow. I've sacrificed career advancement for ethical principles before, Dr. Shao. I can do it again if necessary." Corvin studied him for a long moment. "Most humans, discovering what you discovered, would have reacted with revulsion or invasive curiosity. You reacted with professional focus and respect for boundaries. Ambassador Lyran was correct to trust you, it seems." "She didn't have much choice," Ethan pointed out. "But I'm glad the trust wasn't misplaced. Look, I understand the cultural sensitivity here, but from a purely medical standpoint, this secrecy creates dangerous gaps in cross-species healthcare. If Velari biological complexity is going to remain confidential, there at least needs to be better emergency protocols for situations like this." "That is a reasonable observation." Corvin's tone softened slightly. "Perhaps there is room for limited medical knowledge exchange, under strict confidentiality agreements with carefully selected practitioners." "I'd be willing to participate in developing those protocols," Ethan offered. "Not as a political gesture, but as a medical professional who now has first-hand experience with complications that could arise in mixed-species environments." The conversation was interrupted by Lyran's professionalism and discretion. Threatening him serves no purpose except to validate every fear we have about engaging with other species. "Ambassador, with respect, you violated centuries of protocol." "I violated protocol to preserve my reproductive viability and long-term health," Lyran interrupted sharply. "If you wish to bring formal charges against me for that choice, do so through proper channels. But Dr. Reeves acted only as a healer. He deserves recognition for that, not threats. Corvin's ears flattened frustration. But when he spoke again, his tone was more measured. What would you propose, Ambassador? A pilot program. Limited medical knowledge exchange between select Velari physicians and human counterparts who have demonstrated the capacity for discretion and cultural respect. Dr. Reeves would be an ideal first participant on the human side. Lyran looked at Ethan. If he's willing. I'm willing, Ethan confirmed. Though I think this should extend beyond just human Velari cooperation. If the goal is improving emergency medical care in mixed-species environments, other species should eventually be included too. Eventually, Corvin agreed cautiously, but we must walk before we run. Very well. I will propose this to the medical council. If approved, you will be contacted with parameters for participation. After Corvin departed, Lyran remained, clearly wanting to speak privately despite her obvious need for rest. Thank you, she said simply, for defending me, for defending the trust I placed in you. You don't need to thank me for basic professional ethics, Ethan replied. Though I am curious, why push for this knowledge exchange? You could have just accepted Corvin's approach, maintained the secrecy, moved on. Because I am tired, Lyran admitted. Tired of the weight of secrets, tired of believing my people cannot trust others to see us as we truly are. And because you demonstrated something I had begun to doubt was possible, that a human could encounter our biological reality and respond with healing rather than exploitation or judgment. That's just medicine done right, Ethan said. Bodies are diverse. What matters is treating them with competence and respect, not measuring them against arbitrary norms. That perspective is more revolutionary than you seem to realize. Lyran's eyes shifted to that soft gold-blue color again. In your hands, in that moment when you understood what you were seeing, you had the power to react with shock, revulsion, invasive curiosity. Instead, you simply continued healing me. That choice matters more than you know. She departed with the Velari delegation shortly after, leaving Ethan to process everything he'd learned and everything it might mean for the future of cross-species medicine. 6 months later, the encrypted communication arrived with Velari diplomatic seals and medical authorization codes. Ethan opened it to find an invitation, formal, elaborately worded, but carrying genuine warmth beneath the diplomatic language. He was invited to participate in a Velari medical conference focused on emergency care in mixed-species environments. It would be the first time non-Velari physicians had been granted access to discussions of Velari biological complexity. The invitation included a personal note from Lyran. You treated me with dignity when I was most vulnerable. My people are ready to see if that dignity can extend to mutual understanding. Will you help us build this bridge? Ethan accepted immediately. The conference, when it occurred 3 months later, was conducted with elaborate protocols and careful boundaries. Only 5 non-Velari physicians were invited, each selected for demonstrated cultural sensitivity and professional discretion. The knowledge shared was disclosed with explicit understanding that it remained within medical circles until broader diplomatic consensus determined appropriate expansion. What Ethan learned was profound and humbling. Velari biology was even more complex than he'd understood from treating Lyran. The dual-sex characteristics he discovered were part of a sophisticated hormonal system that regulated not just reproductive function, but aspects of cognition, emotional processing, and social bonding. Velari individuals transition through different biological phases across their lifespan, with each phase bringing different capabilities, vulnerabilities, and needs. Their culture had evolved elaborate frameworks for understanding and celebrating this complexity. The fluidity of Velari biology wasn't treated as confusion or abnormality. It was considered a source of strength, a gift that allowed their species to adapt and thrive across changing circumstances. They'd hidden it all because early contact with other species, including humanity, had demonstrated how poorly most civilizations handled biological difference that challenged binary assumptions about sex and gender. The conference included difficult discussions about whether continued secrecy served Velari interests or had become a barrier to the very integration it was meant to protect. Younger Velari physicians argued passionately that hiding fundamental biology created more problems than it solved, while older practitioners maintained that protection remained necessary given persistent prejudices in the broader concordance. Ethan was careful not to advocate for any particular position. His role was medical, not political, but his presence and the respectful curiosity he showed toward Velari biology without judgment or prurient fascination itself made a statement about what was possible. One evening, during informal discussions after the formal sessions, a young Velari physician named Saren approached Ethan with hesitant curiosity. "Dr. Reeves, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you first saw Ambassador Lyron's true anatomy, when you understood what we had kept hidden, what was your first thought?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Honestly, my first thought was, I need more information to treat this safely. The shock came after when I had time to process implications, but in the moment, I was just focused on doing my job." "You weren't disgusted, disturbed?" "I was surprised," Ethan admitted, "but disgust, no. I've seen too many different kinds of bodies to react with disgust to variation. And disturbed. I was more disturbed by the fact that medical education had failed to prepare me for something this significant. That felt like a dangerous gap in knowledge." Saren's eyes shifted through several colors rapidly, processing complex emotions. "Most species react differently. We have documented responses to accidental discoveries. Revulsion, invasive curiosity, attempts to exploit the information for political leverage. Your response, professional focus on healing, that is uncommon enough to be remarkable." "Maybe it shouldn't be," Ethan suggested. "Maybe if medical education emphasized seeing patients as individuals with diverse biology rather than measuring everyone against narrow templates, these conversations wouldn't be so fraught." "That is a radical proposition," Saren said with what might have been a smile, "and one I hope to see implemented in my lifetime." By the conference's conclusion, Ethan had established professional relationships with a dozen Velari physicians and participated in developing preliminary protocols for emergency care of Velari patients in mixed-species medical facilities. It wasn't dramatic or revolutionary, just careful, methodical work to build frameworks for better health care. But it was a beginning. 2 years after initial treatment, Dr. Ethan Reeves stood in the medical bay of the Asclepius, reviewing the file of his newest patient. Another Velari, injured in circumstances similar to Lyron's attack, with damage that extended to the private anatomy that most species still didn't know existed. But this time, Ethan had protocols. He had consultation networks with Velari specialists. He had medical knowledge that, while still incomplete, was vastly superior to what he'd possessed 2 years ago. And most importantly, he had the patient's trust, earned through the reputation that had spread through Velari medical circles about the human doctor who treated Ambassador Lyron with dignity and discretion. "Dr. Reeves," the young Velari patient said nervously, "I understand you have experience with complicated injuries to private anatomy." "I do," Ethan confirmed gently, "and I want you to know that whatever treatment is necessary, it will be conducted with full respect for your privacy and cultural beliefs. You're not just a medical case to me. You're a person who deserves healing and dignity." The patient's luminescent eyes shifted to that soft gold-blue color Ethan had learned indicated relief mixed with hope. "Thank you. I was afraid. I have heard stories about how other species react when they learn the truth about Velari biology." "I'm not interested in your biology as a curiosity or a secret to exploit," Ethan said. "I'm interested in it because understanding it allows me to provide better care. That's the beginning and end of my professional interest. Everything else is your business, not mine." As he began the examination, Ethan reflected on how far things had progressed in 2 years. The full truth about Velari biology still wasn't public knowledge. That remained a decision for Velari society to make on their own timeline. But within medical circles, quiet knowledge exchange had begun. Protocols were being developed. Trust was being built through individual relationships and demonstrated professionalism. Lyran had been right. Change began with individual choices to trust, to heal, to treat knowledge with respect rather than exploitation. The examination revealed damage similar to what he'd treated in Lyran, serious but manageable with proper care. As Ethan worked, he maintained a steady stream of communication with his patient, explaining each step and checking for consent before proceeding. This was what medicine should be, he thought. Not a power dynamic where providers made decisions for passive patients, but a collaborative process where expertise met with autonomy to produce healing. When the procedure was complete and his patient was resting comfortably, Ethan received a communication from Lyran. She'd been promoted to a senior diplomatic position and was now one of the leading advocates for gradual, controlled disclosure of Velari biological reality to trusted allies. Her message was brief but warm. "I heard you treated another of our people today. With the same dignity and professionalism you showed me, I am not surprised. You have become exactly the bridge builder I hoped you might be. Thank you for proving that trust, carefully given, can be honored and multiplied." Ethan's response was characteristically modest. "Just doing the job right. But I'm grateful the job has expanded to include building understanding alongside healing bodies. Turns out they're not separate goals. They're the same work approached from different angles." That evening, filing his medical reports under the strict confidentiality protocols that now governed Velari cases, Ethan reflected on the moment that had started everything. The freeze when he'd first understood what he was seeing. The shock of discovering a secret that had been kept for centuries. The choice to push past that shock and simply do his job with competence and respect. That moment had been a test, he realized. Not one anyone had designed, but a test nonetheless of whether compassion could transcend even the most fundamental differences. Whether professional ethics could hold steady when confronted with the unprecedented. He'd passed that test not through any special heroism, but through the simple act of remembering what medicine was supposed to be. Seeing people at their most vulnerable and choosing to help rather than exploit that vulnerability. The trembling moment when his hands had stilled. The freeze of recognition followed by the deliberate choice to continue with professionalism and care. That had been the beginning of something larger than one treatment or one patient. It had been the beginning of proof that different species could see each other truly, biology, culture, vulnerability and all, and respond with dignity rather than exploitation. That trust could survive revelation. That healing could bridge even carefully guarded secrets. And perhaps that was the most important discovery, not the biological details of Velari anatomy, but the realization that compassion, carefully applied, could create space for understanding even when fear had built walls to prevent it. The story of the human doctor who discovered Velari biological secrets and responded with healing rather than exploitation spread quietly through medical circles across multiple species. It became a case study in ethical practice, a model for how to handle culturally sensitive medical information, and proof that cross-species healthcare could navigate even the most profound differences with respect and professionalism. But for Ethan, it remained what it had always been, just medicine done right. Bodies in all their diverse complexity, treated with the competence and dignity they deserved. Everything else, the diplomatic implications, the cultural bridge building, the gradual expansion of trust, those were just natural consequences of that fundamental commitment. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Not to change the galaxy overnight, but to prove through careful, professional work that change was possible. That secrets could be shared without exploitation. That difference could be encountered without judgment. One patient at a time. One careful choice at a time. One moment of choosing healing over fear. That was how bridges were built. That was how medicine at its best transformed not just individual health, but the relationships between entire peoples. The freeze had given way to action. The shock had given way to healing. And in that transformation, something precious had been born. Proof that even the most carefully guarded vulnerabilities could be met with dignity when the right person made the right choice at the right moment.